This is the great pattern of history. After long division, the realm must unite. After long unity, it must divide. This is the most famous opening line of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It may also express one of China's most familiar views of history. Yet the two halves of this statement are not really symmetrical. That a long period of unity should end in division is easy enough to understand. Large empires face struggles over succession, regional breakaways, fiscal crises, and civil wars. The Roman Empire broke apart. The Arab and Mongol empires also fractured. In world history, there is nothing unusual about a vast political community eventually falling apart. The real puzzle lies in the other half. After a long period of division, why must unity return? Once an empire breaks apart, the regimes that emerge may gradually build their own armies, bureaucratic systems, and economic interests. They may develop political traditions of their own and turn once temporary borders into stable ones. Europe broadly followed this path. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the kingdoms that emerged did not continue to see themselves as temporary states waiting for Rome to be reunited. They gradually acquired legitimacy as independent political orders in their own right. Division was no longer merely an accident that had yet to be resolved. It became the new order itself. China followed a very different historical path. In China's mainstream political tradition and historical narratives, division was rarely regarded as the formal beginning of a new order. No matter how long it lasted, and no matter how complete the institutions of the different regimes became, they were still likely to be placed within an unfinished chapter of history. They were regional regimes, dynasties confined to only part of the realm, or transitional stages before a legitimate unified order re-emerged. So the idea that a realm long divided must eventually reunite is not a self-evident law of nature. It is itself a historical phenomenon that needs to be explained. Why did China's mainstream political traditions so consistently treat unity as the complete condition and division as a temporary one? Why did a judgment from a novel eventually come to sound like a natural summary of thousands of years of history? This brings us to the question this video is really asking: why didn't China have kings? Of course, Chinese history was never short of rulers who bore the title of king. During the Warring States period, there were kings of Qin, Qi, Chu, and Zhao. After the empire fragmented, there were also many periods when multiple kingdoms and dynasties existed side by side. The real puzzle is why the polities ruled by these kings found it so difficult to acquire lasting legitimacy comparable to that of a unified empire. Why was the coexistence of multiple kings usually only an intermediate stage in history, while the restoration of a single supreme political center above them repeatedly became the final answer? This was certainly not because China had never truly been divided. Before Qin unified the realm, the Warring States period had already lasted for roughly 2 centuries. The different states had their own borders, armies, bureaucratic systems, tax systems, and ruling elites. They fought one another and gradually developed distinct regional identities. But these regional identities were not yet modern nationalism. Modern nationalism generally holds that the state should be organized around a national community, and that an individual's political loyalty should be directed first and foremost toward that community. Today, it is difficult to imagine an American politician losing an election and then moving to China to serve as China's premier. But during the Warring States period, it was not unusual for talented people to seek office across state borders. Wu Qi served in Lu, Wei, and Chu. Shang Yang came from the state of Wei, but led his reforms in Qin. Political loyalties certainly existed within the different states, and treason and espionage were punished. But taking office in another state did not automatically mean that a person had betrayed the nation to which he belonged. What we need to explain, then, is not why an already formed Chinese nation wanted to create a unified nation-state. It is why all under heaven, a political world composed of different peoples and polities, was for so long believed to require a single supreme political center. The Warring States period already contained several of the key conditions that could have produced a durable multi-state system, yet that system never became stable. In 221 BCE, Qin conquered the other 6 states. For the first time, it brought this entire political world under a single emperor and a central bureaucratic system. Just 15 years later, the Qin dynasty collapsed. It was a remarkable failure. The first unified empire quickly fell apart under the weight of excessive demands for labor and military service, a succession crisis, and revolts across the realm. One might have expected Qin's collapse to prove that unity was too costly and too fragile, and that the former multi-state order should once again become the normal state of affairs. But after Qin fell, although multiple kingdoms and competing centers of power genuinely reappeared, they were not institutionalized as a permanent order. The competition that followed was no longer primarily about whether different states could coexist permanently. It was about who was entitled to occupy the single center once again. So the real question is not simply why Qin was able to unify China. It is why, after Qin collapsed, the goal of unity did not collapse with it. The answer may lie in 2 interlocking forces. The first was a state structure capable of reaching into local society, extracting resources, organizing armies, and directly governing vast territories. It made reunification more than an ideal. It made it a politically achievable project. The second was a political conception of all under heaven and dynastic legitimacy. It held that supreme political authority could, in principle, have only one center. Even when multiple states genuinely existed side by side, this conception made it difficult for a multi-state order to become the final, legitimate answer. Organizational capacity made unity possible. Political legitimacy made it a project worth seeing through. Together, they produced what was truly distinctive about Chinese history. The empire could still fracture, but in many periods of division, what people seemed to confront was not a new world that could be accepted as permanent, but an unfinished project of reunification. That is how the idea that a realm long divided must unite came to sound like a law of history. But perhaps it was never merely a description of history. It was also a political belief powerful enough to drive people to launch new wars, reconstruct the state, and decide who had the right to rule all under heaven. This political belief in unity did not exist in fully developed form from the beginning of Chinese history. Around the 11th century BCE, the Zhou defeated the Shang dynasty and began to present themselves as the new supreme rulers. But military victory did not automatically produce stable rule. The Zhou had originally been a political community of limited scale. They faced both surviving Shang forces and threats from within their own royal lineage, while also having to control a vast territory far beyond their original heartland. The Zhou had to solve 3 problems at once: why they had the right to replace the Shang, how they could extend their power into distant regions, and how they could keep these dispersed rulers subject to the same order. Their first step was to formulate a new conception of the mandate of heaven. They declared that supreme political authority did not belong permanently to any one family. If a dynasty lost its virtue and could no longer sustain its rule, heaven could withdraw its mandate and grant another family the right to rule all under heaven. The saying, "High heaven has no favorites, it supports only the virtuous," was, first and foremost, a political justification for the Zhou conquest of the Shang. The Shang had not simply been defeated by a stronger army. It had lost the mandate of heaven because it had ceased to be virtuous. The Zhou, by receiving the mandate, acquired the legitimacy to rule. But this theory also placed constraints on the Zhou themselves. If the mandate could pass from the Shang to the Zhou, it could pass again if the Zhou lost their virtue. Later Chinese dynasties repeatedly used political expressions such as having received the mandate from heaven and acting under heaven's command. These expressions did more than proclaim that the ruler was sacred and beyond challenge. They also stated that political authority came from an order higher than any particular family. It was not property that one family could possess forever. The mandate of heaven answered the question of who had the right to become the supreme ruler. It did not answer the question of how the Zhou could control such a vast territory. Within the royal domain, the Zhou court had its own officials, armies, and administrative system. It also appointed officials and established military outposts in some other areas, but it did not yet have the capacity to reproduce the administration of the royal domain across all the territories it had conquered. The Zhou solution was to send members of the royal lineage and close allies to strategic locations in the east, where they established military settlements. As titles, lands, and governing privileges gradually became hereditary, these settlements developed into regional polities with their own lineages, armed forces, and political centers. This became the foundation of the Western Zhou system of enfeoffment. The Western Zhou was therefore neither a bureaucratic empire, in which the central government directly governed every region, nor an international system composed of multiple equal states. Although the regional lords exercised real and extensive local power, they remained within a shared hierarchy beneath the King of Zhou. But for a hierarchical order to endure, it was not enough to define the position of each political unit at a particular moment. It also had to determine how power would be inherited across generations, and how the continually expanding branches of aristocratic lineages would be accommodated. The patrilineal lineage system served this function. Within this system, the King of Zhou headed the senior lineage of the royal house. The regional lords belonged to junior lineages in relation to the royal house, but within their own domains, they could themselves become the heads of senior lineages. The aristocratic lineages beneath them continued to divide into further branches, creating additional levels of senior and junior lineages. These relationships did not depend entirely on actual blood ties. Enfeoffed nobles who had no direct blood relationship with the ruling family could still be incorporated, through constructed ties of kinship, into the senior-junior lineage order of the royal house, or the ruling house of a regional state. The King of Zhou, the regional lords, and the lower nobility were therefore political rulers at different levels. At the same time, they were understood as occupying different positions within a patrilineal lineage order. Sacrifices, investiture ceremonies, marriages and funerals, tribute, dress, music, and dance continually gave visible expression to this hierarchy. The lineage system did not emerge as a finished design at the beginning of Zhou rule. It developed and became more firmly established over the course of Western Zhou history. But it ultimately organized many dispersed centers of hereditary power into a shared political world. This political world was called All Under Heaven. Here, All Under Heaven was not yet a unified empire directly governed by a central government in the Qin and Han sense. It was a political space with a supreme center in principle, but many hereditary centers of power in practice. For a time, this system was highly effective. These military settlements allowed the Zhou royal house to extend its power into distant regions. Enfeoffment made local rulers responsible for warfare and government. The lineage system and ritual order kept these dispersed units within a shared hierarchy. The King of Zhou did not need to administer every territory directly in order to incorporate vast regions into a common military, ritual, and political order. But this system also contained a long-term contradiction. Once land, population, armed forces, and governing privileges had been handed to hereditary families, the royal house could not simply take them back at will, as it could an administrative office. The longer the regional lords ruled in their own territories, the more resources they accumulated. After several generations, however, the close political and kinship ties that had originally connected them to the Zhou royal house gradually weakened. Meanwhile, neighboring states learned Zhou technologies and methods of organization through warfare, intermarriage, and exchange. The Zhou royal house's original military advantage gradually eroded. Repeated defeats not only depleted its military strength, but also weakened its authority to summon the regional lords, punish those who resisted, and maintain the common order. The regional lords therefore became increasingly unwilling to send troops in support of the royal house. Their growing estrangement, in turn, made it even harder for the Zhou to respond to new threats. Military defeat, political estrangement, and royal decline formed a mutually reinforcing cycle. In 771 BCE, King Yu of Zhou was killed, and Zhangzhou, the Zhou heartland in the west, fell. The following year, under the protection of the regional lords, King Ping of Zhou moved east to Luoyi. The western Zhou came to an end, the eastern Zhou began, and China entered what is commonly known as the Spring and Autumn period. The Zhou royal house did not disappear, but it had lost the practical ability to command most of the regional lords. Real power began to pass into their hands, yet supreme legitimacy did not fully fragment along with it. During the Spring and Autumn period, the strongest states did not usually seek to destroy all the regional lords and turn all under heaven into an empire under their own direct rule. What they first competed for was the position of hegemon, the power to preside over assemblies of the regional lords, organize wars, and lead the other regional lords in maintaining order. The Zhou king no longer had the power to command the regional lords, but he still retained the nominal status of supreme ruler of all under heaven. Except in the few cases when a strong state directly challenged his authority, powerful states continued to invoke the cause of revering the king to legitimize their own expansion and leadership. This reveals an important legacy of the Western Zhou order. In practice, many polities could possess their own armies, territories, and ruling groups. But this did not automatically give them equal claims to supreme legitimacy. Political power had become dispersed, yet all under heaven was still understood as a single whole with, in principle, only one supreme center. The Western Zhou did not create the imperial order of Qin and Han in advance, but it established a political grammar with far-reaching consequences. The ruling house could lose the mandate of heaven and be replaced by another family. But the supreme position from which all under heaven was ruled was still believed to be singular. The idea that a single supreme center was legitimate did not mean that any ruler had the power to unify all under heaven in practice. Turning all under heaven from a hierarchical concept into an empire governed directly by a central authority required an entirely different kind of state structure. This kind of state gradually emerged through prolonged warfare. During the Spring and Autumn period, wars among the regional lords were initially still constrained by the hegemonic order. Powerful states such as Jin and Chu organized the regional lords through assemblies and brought many conflicts into alliance systems led by the great powers. According to Ding Xin Zhao's calculations, before 546 BCE, wars launched by Jin or Chu involved an average of 4 states. A war was often not simply a conflict between two states, but a confrontation between two alliances of regional lords. After the peace conference of 546 BCE, the hegemonic order centered on Jin and Chu gradually declined. The great powers became less capable of coordinating relations among the regional lords, and states that had once depended on the hegemons began to expand on their own more frequently. Afterward, wars launched by Jin or Chu involved an average of only 2.35 states. In the 85 years before the peace conference, Qi initiated 15 wars. In the following 85 years, it initiated 33. War did not become less frequent. It became more dispersed and more difficult to contain within a common order. In the past, a war had often taken place between two alliances. Now, a growing number of states began attacking their neighbors directly. The aim of war was increasingly not merely to force an opponent to submit, join an alliance, or pay tribute. It was to seize land and population, and sometimes to eliminate the opposing state altogether. The changing aims of war, in turn, began to reshape the internal structure of power within each state. In the early regional states, the ruler could not bypass the nobility and directly organize the entire state. Nobles were not administrative officials whom the ruler could appoint and dismiss at will. They were the heads of their own lineages, with hereditary control over land, population, retainers, and armed forces. Warfare required these nobles to lead their own lineages and dependents into battle. When new territory was acquired, the ruler often had to grant the land and the right to govern it to the nobles who had commanded the troops. As a result, the outward expansion of a state did not necessarily make its ruler more powerful. In terms of its structure of control, this was somewhat like a company that kept opening new branches while permanently handing the staff, assets, and management of each branch to its local director. The company grew larger, but the headquarters did not necessarily gain more direct control. The more resources the branch directors controlled, the easier it became for them to sideline the headquarters. Of course, nobles were not professional managers in a modern company. They controlled hereditary land, population, and armed forces. Once they became powerful enough, they could do more than resist the ruler. They could partition the state or seize political power for themselves. The relationship between the Zhou king and the regional lords was not identical to the relationship between the ruler of a regional state and the nobles within it. But the lineage system did organize both relationships into nested layers of senior and junior lineages. As land, population, and armed forces all became hereditary, subordinate nobles at different levels could gradually strip the rulers above them of effective power. Jin was the clearest and most extreme example of this crisis. Jin continued to expand during its struggle for hegemony, but much of the land, population, and military power gained through war passed into the hands of the hereditary aristocratic lineages that commanded its armies. The stronger the state became, the stronger these lineages became as well. Jin was able to dominate a growing number of regional lords, while its own ruler directly controlled fewer and fewer resources. By the late spring and autumn period, infighting among these aristocratic lineages had left Jin unable to maintain its hegemony. Several hereditary lineages absorbed one another until only three remained: Han, Zhao, and Wei. In 453 BCE, the three houses joined forces to destroy the Zhou lineage. This effectively secured their control over Jin and established the basis for its eventual partition. In 403 BCE, the Zhou king formally recognized them as regional lords. The division of Jin exposed the paradox of the old way of war. Reliance on hereditary nobles could allow a state to expand outward, but it could also place enough resources in their hands to hollow out and eventually partition the state itself. But after Han, Zhao, and Wei broke free from the ruling house of Jin, they did not automatically escape the same danger. If they continued to rely on hereditary nobles to administer territory and organize armies, their own nobles might one day do to them what they had done to Jin. At the same time, increasingly intense wars of annexation directly threatened the survival of states. They also required states to command resources far beyond anything lineage-based armed forces could provide. To wage war over the long term, a state needed to know how much land and how many people it controlled, how much grain and tax revenue it could collect, and how many soldiers it could mobilize. Nor could it continue to hand every newly conquered region to hereditary nobles. Otherwise, every act of expansion might create another independent center of power. The states therefore began to develop another way of ruling. They placed local areas under officials appointed by the ruler, expanded systems of household registration, taxation, and conscription, and appointed more officials on the basis of ability and performance rather than hereditary status. War did not create bureaucracy out of nothing. Within the Western Zhou royal domain, relatively stable divisions of administrative responsibility, appointment procedures, and official ranks had already appeared. But these institutions were still embedded in the property and lineage relations of the royal house, and their reach was largely confined to the territories directly controlled by the Zhou king. What warfare during the Eastern Zhou actually did was spread, expand, and recombine these previously limited and dispersed administrative techniques, turning them into tools of competition among states. After the three houses divided Jin, this pressure became especially intense. Han, Zhao, and Wei had witnessed firsthand how hereditary aristocratic lineages could partition Jin. At the same time, they faced increasingly intense military competition from the surrounding states. If they could not directly control local administration, taxation, and armies, they risked being stripped of power from within by a new nobility or destroyed from without by a state with greater organizational capacity. Wei faced the greatest pressure. Its territories were fragmented, and it stood among several powerful states, leaving it almost no room to avoid warfare for long. Marquis Wen of Wei therefore recruited talented men from different backgrounds, including Li Kui, Wu Qi, and Ximen Bao, and further reformed the law, agriculture, local government, and the army. Wei was not the first state to establish counties, adjust taxation, or employ officials who did not depend on hereditary status. Its real importance was that it was among the first to combine these reforms, which had previously appeared separately, into a mutually reinforcing system of rule. A new logic of competition began to take shape. The more rapidly a state expanded while continuing to hand land, population, and armed forces to hereditary nobles, the more likely its internal power structure was to fragment. A state that governed local areas directly through appointed officials, by contrast, could turn more land and people into taxes, grain, and soldiers. The second kind of state gained a greater advantage in war. Military victory then brought it more land, population, and resources, allowing it to extend its administrative control even further. To avoid destruction, other states were forced to adopt similar reforms. At first, warfare depended on the nobility and continually strengthened it. But by the late spring and autumn period and the warring states period, prolonged competition had begun to reward a different kind of state. This state no longer depended primarily on layer upon layer of hereditary aristocratic networks. It was increasingly able to bypass the nobility and directly organize land, population, and armies. China could later be unified not because a particular king suddenly conceived the ideal of unifying all under heaven. It was because prolonged competition had created an unprecedented political instrument, a state capable of drawing taxes, grain, and soldiers directly from household after household. But this only explains why unification became possible. It does not yet explain why Qin, rather than Wei, Qi, Chu, or another state, ultimately broke the balance among the competing states.